This is number 44 in a series of 80 Old Testament lectures, and we're going to take these next few moments and finish summarizing the book of Ecclesiastes. The end of the last lecture I was reading from chapter 4 of the book, verse 2. Solomon, when he returned, and the digest was this, "Wherefore," he said, "I praise the dead which are already dead, more than the living which are yet alive. Yea, better is he than both they which hath not yet been, who hath not seen the evil work that is done under the sun." You know what he's saying here? He's saying this, that the worst person is the person that's living. And it's better to be dead than to be living. But better than to be dead is not to be at all. And there's a little poem that says, "Count o'er the joys thine eyes have seen, count o'er the hours of happy free, and know whatever thou hast been, 'tis something better not to be." In other words, the philosopher was saying, that particular philosopher, that regardless of how many happy hours that you can count up in your experiences of life, it's something better not to be. And humanly speaking, I suppose that's true. In fact, we know it is true. And philosophers used to discuss, is this the best of all possible worlds or the worst of all possible worlds? Well, it depends completely upon one's relationship to Christ. Do you know, in the Bible, often the end of the age is depicted in different phrases. For example, on one occasion, Jesus said, "I must work the works of him that has sent me while it is day. The night cometh when no man can work." So he speaks then of the end of all things as nighttime. But in the book of Romans, Paul speaks of the night is far spent and the day is at hand. Now what is it? Is it the night is coming or is the day coming? Well, it depends. To unbelievers, it's the night. And to believers, it's the day. Let me stop here and just say this, that on one occasion I heard a liberal minister make this statement. He said, "I no longer believe in this sky, in pie in the sky when you die, and a red-hot hell and a sky-high heaven. I think it's unwise to speculate on the furniture of heaven or the temperature of hell." And he went on, and he said, for example, "I believe that hell is on earth." And he said, "You come in and out every day like a swinging door. You experience heaven and hell, but you have it here on earth." And in a way, he's right, do you know? Because this world is the only heaven the unsaved person will ever know. That's true. The only heaven the unsaved person will ever. And there's a beer ad. I think I may have used this as an illustration before that pretty well fits the situation here. It's Schlitz beer, and it says you only go around one time, and you got to grab all the gusto you can get. You know that's true, even to the believer, but especially to the unbeliever. He only goes around one time. And if a man refuses to accept Christ, he ought to go out and live it up, I suppose. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow he dies, you see. And the Bible says that he's going to be better off. I mean, not the Bible, but the world says you'll be dead tomorrow. So live it up today. And but the other statement, this world is the only heaven the unsaved person will ever know. But on the other coin, the other side of the coin here, it is the only hell that the saved will ever know. And the devil better get to us down here because he can't touch us up there. So in a sense, that statement was true, although I wouldn't have accepted it in the attitude that the man made it. And what we're saying here is this the best or worst of all possible worlds? It depends on one's relationship to Christ. Is the end of the world depicted as the night or the day? It depends upon one's relationship to Christ. But here he says, "Under the sun, yea, better is he than both they," if you've never been born, "which hath not yet been, who hath not seen the evil work that is done under the sun." But that's the expression. Apart from God, what he says is absolutely true. He's not an atheist. He's simply saying, if you are an atheist, then you have no hope whatsoever. Someone has said that a definition of an atheist is a person who has no invisible means of support. In chapter 9, he tells us the utter futility futility and uncertainty of this life. Verses 11 and 12. He said, I returned and saw under the sun, again the expression, under the sun. This is a Playboy world type examination. Under the sun, that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, neither yet bread to the wise, nor yet riches to men of understanding, nor yet favor to men of skill, but time and chance happeneth to them all. He's saying that the only reason he was a king was not because he had natural wisdom, God gave him the wisdom, of course, or not because that he may have earned it or deserved it, but that simply because he was the son of David, and he inherited the crown. So, time and chance happeneth to them all. And humanly speaking, this is so true. If a man happens to be in the right place at the right time and has an extra buck and knows how to invest it, he might make a killing on the stock market, or he might be promoted, or he might discover this, or he might do that. It's time and chance, humanly speaking, if you leave God out. Verse 12, and what a fearful verse this is. For man, of chapter 9, also knoweth not his time, like the fish that are taken in an evil net, and like the birds that are caught in the snare, so are the sons of men snared in an evil time, when it falleth suddenly upon them. I remember that terrible day when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, November the 22nd, 1963, in Dallas, Texas. And I used to attend Dallas Theological Seminary, and I can pretty well think my way through the route that he took on the way from the airport to Love Airport, where he got off the plane, to the Board of Trade, where he was in downtown Dallas to deliver a speech. And that speech was to be delivered at 1:30. But about a half hour before that, John F. Kennedy was in eternity, and he was killed, or he was shot at 12:30, and he died about 1. And the speech that he was to deliver at 1:30 was later produced and was later, I should say, printed in the U.S. News and World Report, the entire speech, and you may remember reading it. And time, Mr. Kennedy said in that speech, or would have said in the speech, tomorrow we must do thus and such, and next year America is to do something else, and the next 4 or 5 years this great country will attempt to accomplish the following. But Mr. Kennedy did not know that at 1:30 in the afternoon he'd be in the presence of God. And here he says that the sons of men are snared in an evil time, when it falleth suddenly upon them. But all this is apart from God. And thank God he has a good conclusion here. There's the quest, and then there is the digest, the quest 1 to 2, the digest 3 to 10. But notice the best, man's problem solved. Solomon concludes that even with God, life is often a mystery, but apart from him, it becomes a horrible nightmare. And therefore, he said, it is best if man finds God early in his life and fears God throughout all of his life. Verse 9 of chapter 11, he says, Rejoice, O young man, in thy youth, and let thy heart cheer thee in the days of thy youth, and walk in the sight, in the ways of thine heart, and in the sight of thine eyes. Do what you feel is best. But know thou that for all these things God will bring thee into judgment. So you just mark it down, that this life will be terminated by judgment. Therefore prepare now to be judged later. And what he's trying to say is this, class: if you're not ready to die, you're not ready to live. Therefore, verse 10, remove sorrow from thy heart, and put away evil from thy flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity. Grow up and be a man. This is a nasty world, but learn to live in it with God's help. The conclusion, again, is found in chapter 12. It continues here, verse 1, Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not. nor the years draw near when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. And some of the most striking sentences ever written concerning a human being growing old are found here in verses 3 to 8. And we have J. Vernon McGee in his book summarizes these verses in the following way, starting in with verse 2. He says, while the sun or the light or the moon or the stars are not darkened, nor the clouds return after the rain. He's describing now man growing old. And McGee says, failing eyesight makes it appear that the sun, moon, and stars are getting dimmer. Time flies, and one sad experience follows another. Clouds return after rain. In the day, continuing now this discussion of a man growing old, when the keepers of the house shall tremble. The keepers of the house probably refer to the legs. The old person begins to totter. And the strong men shall bow themselves. The strong men are the shoulders that are no longer erect. And the grinders cease. The grinders are the teeth here. And because they are few. And those that look out of the windows are darkened. Those that look out of the windows refer to failing eyesight. All right, and then in verse 4, and the doors shall be shut in the streets when the sound of the grinding is low. Now that refers to the door shut in the street, refers to being hard of hearing. And then the sound of grinding is low refers to the tongue. The voice of old age gets thin. And it says, and he shall rise up at the voice of the bird, and all the daughters of music shall be brought low. Shall rise up at the voice of the bird. It took an alarm clock to wake him up before. Now the cheep of a bird disturbs his sleep. Of course, the old person gets up early. Daughters of music shall be brought low indicates that he can no longer sing in the choir and cannot carry a tune any more. Verse 5, also when they shall be afraid of that which is high, things that formerly did not frighten him now frighten him. And fear shall be in the way. He no longer enjoys traveling. So the almond tree shall flourish. Our senior citizen is now getting gray-haired if his hair has not fallen out. And then it speaks of grasshoppers here. It says, and the grasshopper shall be a burden. The little things will annoy him now. And his desire shall fail. Romance is gone. There will be no sexual attraction there, of course. And man goeth to his long home. Death comes. Now notice that. And the mourners, that's those that are paid to lament his death, go about the streets. Or ever the silver cord is loosed. That speaks of the spinal column. And the golden bowl is broken. That's the head. And the pitcher is broken at the fountain. That's the lungs. And the wheel broken at the cistern, and that's the heart. Vanity, then, verse 7, shall the dust return to the earth, as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God, who gave it. All right, verse 13. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. After the quest, and then the digest, and now the best. And he's telling all this, and so the people are saying, Solomon, what is the bottom line? What are you trying to say? What have you concluded from all this experience that you've had, these experiences? Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. And Solomon says, that's all I can say. And let's stop now for some coffee, whatever they drank in those days. Fear God and keep his commandments. I have a poem concerning youth that we'll read as we conclude here, and time, that transitory thing. When as a child I laughed and wept, and to my mind time just crept. When as a youth I dreamed and talked, and I beheld the time which walked. When I became a full-grown man, to my surprise the time it ran. When older still I daily grew, and then the time it fairly flew. Soon I shall find in traveling on, the day will come when time is gone. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. And such is the interpretation of the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, for just a few moments, one of the strangest books in the Bible. I don't think it's that difficult to interpret, but it is rather strange. And this is the Song of Solomon. Someone has said that the Song of Solomon was not allowed to be read by the rabbis until they were some 30 years of age. Let me get my introduction here. And this is the only book in the Bible completely given over to the love between a man and a woman. I think we have to keep this in mind also, that this is for mature men and women. That is to say, this depicts the intimate love between a man and his wife, and it also, the usual interpretation here is that this man is King Solomon, but the application might be that this is Christ's love for His church. And I think we have to keep this in mind, that the interpretation is, at least my interpretation that we're teaching here, is that this is a true love account of Solomon and an unknown girl. And she becomes his favorite concubine or his favorite wife among the many that he had. But the application is certainly very clear that this can refer to Christ's love for His church. If we can keep this principle in mind, I think it'll do us in good stead in interpreting any passage in the Bible or any book, that there is only one interpretation of any given passage. There may be many applications, but one interpretation. And my interpretation is that this is the story, the historical account of Solomon following in love and marrying a Jewish girl. It has 3 acts, and sort of like a Shakespearean play here, we've tried to put it down in our notes in that way. Let me give you the background of the story. Act 1 is entitled The Shulamite Cinderella. Act 2 is entitled The Shepherd Stranger, and Act 3, The Mighty Monarch. The Shulamite Cinderella, the Shepherd Stranger, and the Mighty Monarch. Act 1, The Shulamite Cinderella. Solomon had a vineyard in the hill country of Ephraim, just outside the little town of Shunem, about 50 miles north of Jerusalem. And this vineyard was rented out to a family of sharecroppers, consisting of a mother, 2 sons, and 2 daughters. And the oldest of these girls was the Shulamite, and the youngest her little sister. And the Shulamite, the oldest girl, was the Cinderella of the family, having great natural beauty but unnoticed by the world, and she becomes the heroine of the story here. Well, her brothers, the Shulamite girl's brothers, made her work very hard tending the vineyards, so that she had little opportunity to care for her personal appearance. For example, in chapter 1 and verse 6 we read, she says, "Look not upon me because I am black, because the sun hath looked upon me. My mother's children were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards, but mine own vineyard have I not kept." What she's saying is this, is not that I'm a Negro when she says that I'm black. She's not talking about her race at all, but she's talking about the condition of her complexion, the skin. Of course, Middle Eastern women apply ointment to their face to keep it from drying out, and we can imagine this is very needful in the desert sun. But she was so poor and she had so much work to do that she didn't even have time to purchase the cheap ointment that the desert women would use to keep their face in satisfactory condition. So she said, "Don't even look at me because I haven't had a chance to really use any type of cosmetic whatsoever upon my face." All right, now, she worked very hard, this little Shulamite Cinderella girl. She pruned the vines. She set traps for the little foxes, and she kept the flocks. And then, of course, being out in the open so often, she became sunburned. And thus ends Act 1, the Shulamite Cinderella. Act 2, the shepherd stranger. One day, a mysterious, handsome stranger comes to the vineyard. And he strikes up a conversation, and soon he wins the heart of the Shulamite girl. Now, unknown to her, this stranger, who pretended to be a shepherd, was really Solomon, disguised as a lowly shepherd. Well, she asks him about his flocks. She says, "Tell me," verse 7, "O thou whom my soul lovest, where thou feedest, where thou makest thy flock to rest at noon. For why should I be like one that turneth aside by the flocks of thy companions?" I'd like to visit. I want to know more about you. Well, he answers rather evasively, but he's very definite concerning his love for her. He tells her, he says that, "I love you," he said, "with all my heart." And he gives a description of his love. Now, he leaves her. He says he has to leave. But he promises that he will someday return and fetch her as his bride. Now, it's rather difficult to pick up the story from this time on, but I think that during his absence, she dreams of him on 2 occasions. And the first dream is recorded in chapter 3 here. She dreams that they were already married. And we do not have to work up much imagination to realize that this certainly she would, this would be a type of dream that she would dream, that they were already married, and that one night she awakened to find him missing from her bed. And she quickly dressed and went out and looked for him. Now, I don't know all the implications of the dream, but that seems to be one of her dreams. And then the second dream, she dreams that her beloved had returned and besought her to open the door and let him come in. But she had refused, for she was unwilling to reclothe herself and soil her feet going to the door. So she, for some reason, doesn't want him to come in. Well, soon, however, her heart smote her for this shabby action, and she leaped for the door. But he had gone when she got to the door. And we read this. She says, "My beloved put in his hand by the hole of the door. I rose up to open to my beloved, and my hands dropped with myrrh, and my fingers with sweet-smelling myrrh upon the handles of the lock." And he wasn't there, but there was evidence that he had been there, and she's so ashamed. Dr. J. Vernon McGee informs us that a lovely custom of that day was for the lover to place sweet-smelling myrrh inside the handle of the bride's door, and that's what she had come in contact with when she runs to the door. Well, the bride then began her frantic search for her lover that she had so carelessly ignored, and she's still dreaming now. And during her search, the guards of the city mistreated her, and the watchmen of the wall tore off her veil. She then pleaded with the women of Jerusalem to aid her in finding her lover and informing him of her love for him. And suddenly and joyfully she discovers his whereabouts. In chapter 6, she says, "My beloved is gone down into his garden, to the beds of spices, to feed in the gardens and to gather lilies. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine, and he feedeth among the lilies." Well, these then are her 2 dreams concerning the mysterious shepherd lover of the Shulamite girl. But why did he leave her? Where did he go? And would he ever return? And that then brings us to Act 3, the mighty Monarch. One day, after these 2 dreams have long since gone, the little town of Shunem receives some electrifying news. And the news was this, that King Solomon himself, the mighty king of Israel, was approaching their city. Well, the lovesick and lonely maiden is not interested, and she takes no further notice until word is brought to her that this powerful potentate himself desired to see her. Well, she's puzzled, and she doesn't understand why he'd want to see her until she's brought in his presence, where she recognizes him as her beloved shepherd. Well, he gently explains to her his background and everything, and he invites her to come and join him in his chariot, and they ride off then in sort of the story, where the bridegroom gets the bride, and they ride off in the sunset to the palace and live happily forever after. And I think this is the correct interpretation, but certainly the application can be compared to Revelation 19, when the Lord Jesus Christ comes with his bride, and when they live together happily forever and ever in the new heavenly city, New Jerusalem. This pretty well then takes us up to the final book that we will discuss concerning the United Kingdom stage, included in the United Kingdom stage, the Book of Proverbs. It is not difficult to outline the Book of Proverbs. It is impossible. There are two books in the entire 66 that I have just been driven up a wall to attempt to outline, and one is Proverbs, and the other is the book of Jeremiah. And if any of my students and listeners to this tape have seen or have come up with a good outline of either Jeremiah or the book of Proverbs, I would appreciate it very much if you would send me this chapter or this outline. By way of introduction, we can say that a proverb is a short sentence drawn from long experience. And there are several authors of the book of Proverbs here. It gives at least four. Solomon normally has been ascribed of writing chapters 1 through 24 of the 31 chapters here. And then the men of Hezekiah writes chapters 25 to 29. Remember, he was a king that wrote some psalms later on. And then a man named Agur, A-G-U-R, we know nothing about him. This may just be another name for Solomon, but he wrote Proverb number chapter 30. And then King Lemuel, L-E-M-U-E-L. Some believe that this is a nickname for Solomon, and that he also was the author of Proverbs chapter 31. But these are not the only Proverbs that Solomon wrote. When we studied his life, we said that he wrote 3,000 Proverbs and composed 1,005 songs. And in the book of Proverbs, we have somewhat less than 300, I believe. So approximately 1/10 of what he wrote is recorded here. The book tells a story. The book of Proverbs, it's the picture of a young man starting out in life. And his first lesson is given in chapter 1, verse 7. For the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Okay, now, two schools bid for him, this young man starting out in life, and both send out their literature. One is the school of wisdom, and the other the school for fools. And this man now has to determine which of these two schools he'll enroll and he'll graduate from. The key word of Proverbs is, of course, wisdom. A little outline says this, that wisdom will protect her students, wisdom will direct her students, and wisdom will perfect her students. It'll protect, it'll direct, and it'll perfect. There are several classic passages in this book, and we'll get into these a little later on. The book of Proverbs, someone has said, is the Old Testament epistle of James. As we said before, it's impossible to offer a chronological outline of the book of this book in the Bible, and so we've simply taken 12 main subjects and discussed them and tried to take verses and arrange under these subjects. And here are the subjects: a good name, and what the book of Proverbs has to say about this; youth and discipline, what the book has to say about this; and then business matters, that's the third subject. The fourth is marriage. The fifth, immorality. The sixth, evil companions. The seventh, wisdom. The eighth, self-control. The ninth, strong drink. The Bible has a lot to say that in Proverbs. 10, friendship. 11, words of the tongue. And 12, I've just entitled various groupings because I couldn't even find a subject for these various groupings here, found especially in chapter 30. All right. I think it would be good at this time to simply take you through the book, and there are some key passages here, and you'll have all these other topics outlined in your notes, but if you'll turn to the Book of Proverbs, you've not done it before, I want to read in your hearing several passages, and according to my watch here, and we're trying to keep this as close to the 44-minute lecture period as we can, I have approximately 15 minutes, and I'm just going to turn to the man that's helping me now and ask, is that the question? He says 14 minutes, all right. Let me read some of these passages here. In chapter 1, verse 24, these are fearful words, and even though they do refer to wisdom, yet, in a sense, it is God speaking to the sinner. I don't know if you've ever read them in that light or not, but consider doing that now as I read them. Because I have called, and ye refused. I have stretched out my hand, and no man regarded. But ye have set at naught all my counsel, and would none of my reproof. Because God says you wouldn't answer my call. I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your fear cometh. When your fear cometh as desolation, and your destruction cometh as a whirlwind, when distress and anguish cometh upon you, then shall they call upon me, but I will not answer. They shall seek me early, but they shall not find me. For they that hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. These are frightening words, and when we think of this, I usually think of Saul in the Old Testament. God did not answer him in his hour of need. God laughed at him, in a sense, because he had laughed at God, and it drove him to the witch of Endor, and finally to an everlasting hell. In chapter 3, verses 5 and 6 have meant so much to my own life, and I think that you ought to, if you've not done this already, underline or mark in red these verses. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. And then also in this chapter, chapter 3, verses 11 and 12 are quoted in the book of Hebrews, chapter 12. My son, despise not the chastening of the Lord, neither be weary of his correction. For whom the Lord loveth, he correcteth, even as a father the son in whom he delighteth. And we're just going to call your attention to various passages here. In chapter 6, verse 16, we read this. These 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination to him. And he lists 7 things that God hates. God hates a proud look. God hates a lying tongue. God hates hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that deviseth wicked imaginations, feet that be swift in shedding and turning to mischief, a false witness that speaketh lies, and he that soweth discord among the brethren. These things God hates. In verse 27 is a verse that every young man, as well as older men, certainly young people, as well as older adults, should take into consideration. Can a man take fire in his bosom and his clothes not be burned? Can one go upon hot coals and his feet be not burned? So he that goeth into his neighbor's wife, whosoever toucheth her, shall not be innocent. And so much of the book of Proverbs is given over to immorality. I'll just quote some of these passages. It means to flout the law of God, chapter 2, verse 17. It leads along the road to death and hell, chapter 2, verse 18. It pollutes the conscience, chapter 5, verse 4. It causes one to groan in anguish and shame when disease consumes the body, in chapter 5. It leads to bitter remorse. It will be judged by God. It will bring a man to poverty. It will burn the soul as surely as fire burns the skin. And in chapter 7, we're told that it can be compared, immorality, to an ox going to the butcher, or to a trapped stag awaiting the death arrow, or to a bird flying into a snare. And chapter 7 gives us the actual account of a man that Solomon watches from his palace window as he goes into what we would call a house of ill repute. In chapter 8, we have, I believe, a wonderful description not only of wisdom, but of the Lord Jesus Christ. I want to read it. Chapter 8, verse 22, "The Lord possessed me in the beginning of his way, before his works of old. I was set up from everlasting, from the beginning or ever the earth was. When there was no depths, I was brought forth, when there were no fountains abounding with the water. Before the mountains were settled, before the hills was I brought forth. While as yet he had not made the earth, nor the fields, nor the highest part of the dust of the world. When he prepared the heavens, I was there. When he set a compass upon the face of the depth. When he established the clouds above, when he strengthened the fountains of the deep. When he gave to the sea his decree, that the waters should not pass his commandment, when he appointed the foundations of the earth. Then I was by him, as one brought up with him, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him." This is certainly a beautiful description of wisdom incarnate in the Lord Jesus Christ. There's another passage a little later on that we'll begin, or that we'll read if we have time, that will speak of the Savior before the foundation of the world. In chapter 14, we read these verses. "There is," chapter 14, verse 12, "there is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Even in laughter the heart is sorrowful, and the end of that mirth is heaviness." That way that seemeth right unto man, I suppose, is a good description of religion. And religion seems right unto man, but the end of religion are the ways of death. In chapter 14, verse 34, "Righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people." Madeline Murray O'Hare wanted to take the phrase, "In God we trust," off our coins. That would be all right with me if we would put Proverbs chapter 14, verse 34 back on that coin. In chapter 15, we read these words, "A soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger." And of course, these are proverbs that we know fairly well. Chapter 16, verse 3, we have a strange proverb here, and yet I think it's very logical as you stop to think about it. "Commit thy works unto the Lord, and thy thoughts shall be established." Now, wait a minute, Dean Willmington, you must have read that wrong. It should be, "Commit thy words." No, it isn't either. It's just exactly what he says. "Commit thy works unto the Lord, and thy thoughts shall be established." Now listen, how do you account for this? Well, don't man's thoughts determine his works? In a sense, that's certainly true. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. But often the very works we do determine the thoughts. For example, here Sunday morning, we get up and we decide, I'm going to go to church. That's a kind of work. That is to say, we determine the course of action we're going to take. So we go to church, and we may expend energy in getting there, and having get all the kids ready to go and everything, and driving a long distance. And we get there, and we expend some work. And we sit there, and we listen to the message. And then God has a chance to speak to our hearts and to our minds. And our thoughts then are honoring to God. See, if we commit our works, then God will take care of our thoughts. That's what the proverb is saying here. All right, in chapter 16, verse 18, certainly a proverb that has been experienced by myself many times and possibly by you also. "Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. There's a little poem that says, when the danger least thou fearest, then the tempter's snare is nearest. There's a couple of other passages that we need to call your attention. Let's see if I can find this here. If not, we'll go on over. We have just a few more minutes left. I wanted to call your attention the last chapter, chapter 31. Of course, every Mother's Day this is read in our churches. Who can find, verse 10 of chapter 31, a virtuous woman, for her price is far above rubies. I think it's interesting that God would use Solomon in order to write this. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines, and yet here he says, who can find a virtuous woman? I've not been able to do so, for her price is far above rubies. The heart of her husband doth safely trust in her, so that he shall have no need of spoil. Well, apparently Solomon could not find one of the 700 that he could really trust. In verse 30, he says, favor is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised. With these words, we'll conclude then the final lecture of the United Kingdom stage. And the next lecture will begin then the longest of the stages, and in some ways the saddest, the chaotic kingdom stage.
This completes Lecture 6B of the Judges and the United Kingdom stages, Units 5 and 6. You may now take your midterm exam. You will find it in the exam packet marked Midterm E1. After all midterm exams have been taken for Units 1 through 6, you will proceed to the final exam covering Units 1 through 6. This exam will be found in the final exam packet and should be taken in the presence of your proctor.